Welcome to another edition of Arts and Ideas. I'm Sue Swinand, and today we're over at the Sprinkler Factory at 38 Harlow Street in Worcester, and we're going to be talking with visual artist Lisa Barthelson. Lisa's been a major force in the art world in these parts for many years, exhibiting widely and being a great supporter of many arts institutions. But this time she has a great big show at the Sprinkler Factory, which she's been working on quite a while, and I'm delighted to have you here, Lisa, as our interviewee today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Sue. It's great to see you.
I'd like to start off maybe just by talking about this show, and tell us whatever you want about it. It's a spectacle.
Well, this is the Sprinkler Factory Gallery, and I have a studio downstairs that's adjacent to the Blackstone Print Studio, and I've shown here a number of times in group shows and once in a two-person show. And I've always aspired to having the entire space for an exhibition that I put together, and this was my opportunity. It's a huge space. I think it's one of the nicest gallery spaces in Worcester. It's on the upswing. It's now being managed by a gentleman named Louis Antonio Frere, and it has a full schedule of exhibitions. And this particular exhibition is an installation that was put together in 5 days, and that was probably the biggest constraint and the biggest challenge for me.
Oh my God, I can just imagine trying to install this show in 5 days.
It was...
Where was all the stuff? Where did you...
Well, the initial concept...
tell us the title of the show first.
The title of the show is Climbing Trees, Making Forts, an installation by Lisa Barthelson, and a family debris installation. I've been working on the family debris series for, I don't know, about 6, 7, maybe more years. It began when I started to purge my children's clothing and toys, and I felt like I needed to use them as art materials because we already owned them, and there was a certain pleasurable penance. I put out the challenge to use this debris and material to tell a little bit of my family's history, to use them as visual elements, texture, color, form, to transform them, to, though I don't like the term upcycle, but to repurpose them. And
recycle.
Right.
Yes.
So I have a garage that was chock full of stuff, and I decided to set certain parameters. We rented a truck, a 10-foot U-Haul, took as much out of the garage as would fit in that truck, delivered it here, dumped it on the floor, and then I had 5 days to see what kind of show I could put together.
She said she was a person who liked challenges.
I do love challenges, and I like to push myself. I've told other people my mantra throughout this was have fun and be brave. If you talked to me last Thursday, I was sort of teetering on the have fun thing, but I did try to stay very calm and enjoy it. I tend to be a solo worker. I like to work by myself and focus in my studio and frankly in my head, but to make this happen, I really had to use and ask for assistance from friends, and that was a good exercise for me. I think that collaboration is a really important part of art making and of life, and in order to get things up and make it happen in 5 days, I did have to ask people, and I think it wouldn't have happened without that. There was a young man named Reiner, and I'm going to butcher his name, but he is an expert at getting things hung from high distances, and part of the beauty of the Sprinkler Factory Gallery is the height of the ceiling and the windows, and to make the most of that and to really make this space sing, I needed somebody who was not afraid of heights.
He's an amazing guy in what he can do. Reiner.
He's an artist, Reiner.
Yeah.
And so that made a big difference. I had other friends who came in and offered, really menial support, which is what most artists do to get things up. The hanging of one of the large monoprint pieces, I really drew on my sister, who's an artist also, and we went back and forth on how to arrange it. But the overall challenge was to really use this space in a way that I'd never had the opportunity to do before. And part of that was to tell the story of, or to pay homage to my childhood, which really revolved around climbing trees and making forts. It was a spare but delightful childhood, and comparing it to what my children had, which I found was incredibly excessive, and I'm an accessory to that, along with just sort of societal. I want to use those materials to really sort of talk a little bit about the simplicity of childhood versus the consumer extravaganza that my children grew up in.
And almost the pressure we have from all of our stuff.
Right.
Where, you know, where is the simplicity of climbing trees and lying
Right.
looking at the sky when you have stuff everywhere
Right.
around you? Well, you know, let's begin with this piece, which, now, would you call this installation work?
I would call this installation. This is from a lot of the debris that was in my garage. I wanted to make a fort like I would have made as a child. Some of the materials are art materials that were for other projects that either didn't get used or did get used and they're reused. A lot of the materials are clothing, little rugs. Mama, the gallery cat, has taken this over. A lot of the toys.
Does she move from exhibition to exhibition?
I think she moves from cubby to cubby, but
Well, I mean,
she
if
really.
you show it again, are you going to hire her?
Maybe. She would love it.
So anyway, this piece is, it's an installation piece. What other kinds of works do you have in this show?
All of the work is either family debris, comprised of family debris, or artist debris, meaning I've reused it in some of the elements in different ways.
But you've got sculpture, you've got installation, you've got monoprints.
Right.
You really run a gamut. She's a multimedia artist, so
I like it all.
She likes it all. So tell us about this piece.
This piece is called Caught, C-A-U-G-H-T, and it's a reference to being caught in the massive overabundance of stuff through consumerism. It uses each of the many junky items that we acquired and collected as little bits of color, shape, texture, and the composition is over the top.
Well, you know, I was wondering about that, whether you, when you do these installations of these big recycling things, whether you're thinking about the aesthetics of formal design and composition.
I am. I think it's a little bit of chaos, but there is a compositional underpinning and
order
that I have to attain before I really feel that it's done. And I'm not sure that's always perceived by everyone, but I think people who have a trained eye do see the compositional elements, and for me personally, they have to be there.
So there's a certain balance between the red objects or the directions of
Right.
the hockey sticks or whatever that carry the eye through the paint. It's like a painting, really, but with three-dimensional materials.
Or like a quilt, I think in
Yeah.
some ways of it
Yeah.
being like a quilt. And in addition, you have the 3D aspect, so as you come at it from an angle, you see the things poking through and reaching out at you.
There's also a lot of humor in the piece, you know, all the those crazy, wacky things that, and as you say, the excessiveness of what
Right.
we buy and keep and use and think we need.
And I think people would, if they really look, they'd see there are vignettes that are a little bit of my commentary on some of the objects.
Well, I have to admit this is my favorite piece, and I think part of it is because I find it so beautiful. And we were just talking about beauty and how that can or cannot be a factor when you're making something, and also that there can be all different kinds of beauty. Mental beauty, sometimes just an experience of something can be a wonderful, transcending experience. But just as an example, when I walked in today, my experience of this was totally different than when I was here at the opening. When I walked in today, it felt like rain. It felt like rain falling or a waterfall, or whereas the other night when I was here, it felt like little moons and very, very different, like some kind of thing in space. So it definitely gave me an aesthetic experience or a moment of transcendence when I look at this piece, which is something I always enjoy looking at art. but I love the way it moves. It's really an elegant piece, as the others are a little bit more funny and,
Right.
you know, not so much about that
The simplicity
yeah.
of line.
So what is the name of this piece?
This is called Slinky Mangalomatic.
Mangalomatic.
Actually, Mangalorama, excuse me. And this is a little bit of artist excess. I had 2 Slinkies from my children's toys that I had pinned on my studio wall. I loved the line. I loved how they changed in light and shadow. And I happened to notice as I was going into Target that in the dollar section going in, they had the small ones. So I started to buy a couple every time I went in over the last couple of years. And I think it was in 2009 or 2010, I did my first installation at Eagle Hill School in Hardwick. And it was site-specific. The Slinkies were hung in various ways, and after that, I think I've done 4 or 5 installations, and after each installation, I'd put away the Slinky very carefully, and this time I decided to go wild and let the Slinky do what it likes to do, which is tangle. And it was very liberating. I could really make the most of the line and the shadow and the way the Slinkies caught the light, just through the variation of really molding and shaping the Slinkies with my hands. And then there's, of course, the motion aspect, which is really appealing.
And any movement of in the room is going to affect the way the light glitters and so forth. The other thing I think that's really important about the Slinky piece for me is it really revealed to me the way Lisa is using she's a great lover of nature. And when I looked at this show, I didn't see nature right away because it's all this debris. And that was a little bit shocking for me because she's done other series that were made out of twigs, like the Nest series, and that were so much out of natural materials. And this one is all man-made materials. But then I began to realize that it's the structures of nature that you're imitating or taking in this show. And another really cool thing is that you begin to see the similarity between very disparate works. So these are long lines dropping and then clustering and then dropping. So they're designed in a certain way and structured in a certain way that relates, for me, very much to the sculptural pieces with the cloth. But it's interesting how you're using that part of nature, but in your own way with very unusual materials.
I think in nature there's a creation of space, and I like to feel that all of these objects in a way do create space. The fact that people, for the most part, recognize and respond to a Slinky but look at it in a different way now. And maybe even just the pure pleasure of thinking, I hated how my Slinky always tangled, but wow, this is pretty cool, this is appealing. So I like to have people look at things in a different way. And I appreciate your reference to nature because nature does shape everything I do. I need to spend time outside. But then when I go inside, there is a certain, I think I've mentioned it, a penance in really dealing with all this stuff that you've accumulated and using it in a way that's satisfying to me.
Feeling
and perhaps
obligated
people respond.
to recycle and obligated
and excited,
to make use of and challenged by.
Challenged and excited.
Yes.
You know, I love the challenge.
Yes. Well, I also think that these are like drawings in space, of course, which
the calligraphic line.
Yeah, they're just lovely. All right, let's look at the 3D sculptural pieces. I can't get over how these remind me so much of the Slinkies. It's the same exact system of wrapping. Now, how are they made?
Well, each one of these is made with 100 feet of 12 gauge wire, and they're all
exactly 100
exactly 100 feet. And they all are made from clothing that was abandoned, used, and I'll be honest, was found in the back of the garage because it never made it to Goodwill. Had a little bit of mouse nesting in it. And I cut each piece, and I learned how to cut any piece of clothing into one strip, which was totally satisfying. And then
one continuous strip.
One continuous strip. And then they're wound and knotted to create this long, sort of textured, and in this case, there are selected palette.
Now,
Yeah,
And-
that selected palettes. Go.
And you can use them in infinite ways, which is really appealing to me. They could be long. When I brought them here, I thought that I'd be using them as long 100-foot extended pieces of sort of, again, calligraphic line made out of this fabric texture, but I had wound them tightly, and I liked them tight, and started to just expand them to a certain point. I really like the sculptural aspect of them, that they could be changed in any space, any location, any unit.
So they're malleable and they become
Exactly.
something different every time you
Right.
show them.
Right.
They're amazing. Now in this installation, you went down and put all the pieces in a central row, and of course these are sculptures.
Right.
These are hanging sculptures. But you were telling me you're going to be making more of these, and I'm thinking to myself, she needs more of these, but.
Well, I love making them. They're very meditative. It's almost like I don't knit, but I could see
Come
that
this way.
there is a knitting aspect, a meditative aspect. And once I got them combined in one space, I could see an entire space filled with these shapes. And again, you can maneuver them, you can shape them, they can be expanded, they can be compressed, and I'm excited by them. It's almost a new language.
Now this is a little different. These are monoprints, and I love the way you've installed them in a very random kind of way, filling this whole wall. How many prints are in this?
75. Originally, when I did these prints a number of years ago, there were, I think, 86 or 87. Some were sold. And at that point, it's been installed as a room installation twice, where they move as a band around the four walls. In this installation, I really wanted them to evoke foliage, and an homage to trees. And I think
and
there
the
is
coloration
right.
is that for sure.
There's an organic quality. These are created by laying family debris on a plexi plate. A lot of it's ephemeral, and removing the debris to create voids and positives and
What do you
layering
mean it's
colors.
ephemeral? A lot of it's
A lot of
ephemeral.
it's ephemeral in that it's string, it's labels, dental floss.
You mean stuff that you throw away? Is that what you're
Right,
saying? Ephemeral?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So all of the items, for the most part, rubber bands that were put on the plate were things that you would throw out, things you wouldn't even recycle.
So
for
then
the most
explain
part.
your monoprint process a little bit. For example, if this is a wad of string, when you ink up, that will lift up the ink on the plate. Is that it?
Well, there are a number of ways you can do it. First, you ink the plate and you put the debris on it, and you put it through the press, and anywhere where the debris is a white or a light
right.
or a
So
void.
you see the white string
Right.
because
Right.
the string is on top of the ink.
Right, and then you remove those items, and you have the voids, and you might put new items on, and you'll have a second bit of color. Or you could use the items you took off, turn them over, and have the inked side of the items. So then you get inked items.
And some of these items are actually collaged too,
Right.
aren't they?
Right.
So there's the print of the the virtual string, but then there's the actual string.
Exactly. So the items that I used to create the prints, I then later collaged on some of the larger pieces, never on the smaller pieces, but on the larger pieces to add another layer. And more, again, we get back to composition, what I personally thought worked from a compositional standpoint. I liked the opportunity to have such a large wall to make something that I felt was a more organic installation, and again made a reference in my mind to trees. And to get them all up at one time again was really exciting to me.
The interesting thing that you might notice if you look at these carefully is that each one of them works as a unique entity. Each one is a total idea. It's almost like I'd like to take this down and just see how wonderful it is all by itself. But as a mass and as a grouping, the whole concept is expanded.
Right.
And I think that's really quite interesting. Another thing I could point out on these, since we're so close, is that here's a bit of that physical net bagging that you would get your onions in,
And here's the print of it where it has blocked the ink and left a white line. So that's a good way of seeing exactly what's going on the plate. And of course, I'm beginning to see little matches and key rings and all kinds of things printed in the negative. It's almost like a negative photograph, you know.
Well, I like to be able to layer. I have a thing for layering, sort of creating history and the ghosts from earlier prints. And at one point when I was working on these, I thought of, in fact, in a landfill, how you find things layered and layered and layered. But what I
or in archaeology.
Or in archaeology. But I like the idea that from a distance, if you look at this, I don't think you, for the most part, see the debris. So you just get an overall wash of color and texture and variation. But as you move in closer, you see, oh, these images, these shapes, these textures are created from debris, just random debris, which gives another layer to, I think, the experience of looking at them.
You know, the idea of nature and the forest, and I was just thinking to myself how many times I walk in the woods and literally see this kind of debris on the floor of the forest, and it's heartbreaking to see people use the forest as a dumping ground.
Right.
Let's look at the I call it the murmuration one. So now I'd like to show the audience this piece, which is very, very different, but I also love this piece because I happen to be enamored. This piece reminds me of the murmurations of starlings that you see, those forms that just kind of, oh my God, they're so magical. And this captures that feeling, really.
Well, this is using bird netting. Again,
it's bird netting.
It's bird netting. I have a thing for using materials, particularly fencing in alternate ways, construction fence, deer fencing, to create grids, and bird netting. I think it was a couple of years ago when I got my hands on bird netting and I started making temporary forms and shapes with push pins. I was at an artist residency and I spent a couple days just making new shapes and installation, pinning them in, taking photographs, experimenting with layering the netting because you get different levels of opacity. And when you step back, it almost looks like a charcoal drawing. For this particular piece, I actually did this a number of times because initially it was too high or it was too dark to work with this large form, and I wanted it to complement it, but to create a backdrop for it while being its own piece. And I love that you can take this down, stuff it in a bag, go to the next location, and create an all-new work.
And make it again.
Or make it, and it will always be different. It goes back to that reusing materials over and over and over again.
It's a surprise every time, and it fits the space that it's made in that time.
Right, and it's that recycling thing. I mean, if you really want to think about it, I have all these materials that I've been using that were from my family, but I also have what I call artist debris. And those are materials that I've accumulated, and I like the challenge of trying to reuse them in a different way, in a different site. And that, again, excites me.
You know what else I just noticed about when I'm standing close to this piece? And you were talking about the bird netting, but all the little grid, each little rectangle or square has a little cross point where they're joined. And it reminds me of like the coordinates that you see for the heavens or something. It's a beautiful underpinning of structure.
Well, I think part of it is because it's a light material, and I like that it can, in fact, have a flexible grid that really takes on other shapes and other sort of, again, levels of darkness.
This piece kind of reminds me too, as I'm looking at it, besides the explosive energy frenzy coming out of the electrical ball, but it also reminds me of the feet that, like from something from Star Wars with these rag-coated feet walking along.
And that was an indoor treatment. I liked them to be tapered and almost like a Gumby leg, to be honest with you, to sort of ground it. So it's grounded here, but the pressure of what looks like a light, loose ball, which actually isn't, pressing down on the tripod, which is a very strong structure.
But just wadding them at the bottom like that, and the winding again is very similar to the other windings. Now, this piece is a canvas, actually.
Yes.
And, but it's also printed.
Correct. It's painted. It's actually painted. The matrix is from deer fence. Again, we go back to the grid from a fencing.
So that grid is ubiquitous.
Yes, right. And this was done in a residency where I had a large, extensive wall. It's, I think, over 16 feet. But some of the circles are hand done and some use tree stamps. I'm a landscape architect. And those go back to what I used in my early professional days before computers were the dominant design tool. It's called Mind Map 1. If you stand back, you can see there are large circles that are created. I have an obsessive thing for circles that create nodes that define pathways in a way that I think my mind works. It sort of jitters from place to place. There is, again, composition and underlying structure, but at certain distances, it can look chaotic, but there is order.
Yeah. And there's also that idea of expanse and then cluster, just like in the murmuration or just like in the hanging soft sculptures.
Right. Different experience close up compared to stepping back.
Last question. What's your attitude toward painting at this point? You doing much
It was
painting?
very liberating to be somewhere else and to pick up a paintbrush. It's been a really long time. So I enjoyed the process. I like to have lots of tools in my tool belt, and I like to push myself. I don't want to get too focused on one thing.
So what's coming? Are you going to stay with this series for the near future?
I'm going to do a
stay
lot
with
of
the debris. And
a lot of print making. I've been making large prints that have collage and stitching, and I'm really enjoying that. I'll continue to do these wire and worn pieces, and I will continue to use family debris. I'm going on a residency in Nebraska where my great-grandparents homesteaded, so I'm going to experience a new landscape, and that's very exciting to me also.
wow, lots of things coming up for Lisa. Lisa Barthelson, it's been a great pleasure talking to you about your work. Thanks a lot, kid.
Thanks, Sue. You're the greatest.
Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again another time for another edition of Arts and Ideas.